If you're looking to buy a new MacBook, it's probably never been this confusing to figure out which one you should buy, especially now that the controversial M2 MacBooks have joined the lineup. But don't worry, I can guarantee that if you stick through this video to the end, you'll know exactly which MacBook is right for you. But before we get into explaining all of the differences between these MacBooks, I've got to talk about the prices for each one in the lineup, starting with the M1 Air, which retails for $1,000, but you can find on sale on Amazon for as low as $850. Then we have the redesigned M2 Air for $1,200, which hasn't went on sale yet. The M2 MacBook Pro, which retails at $1,300, but is currently on sale for $1,200. The 14-inch MacBook Pro for $2,000 or $1,800 on sale on Amazon, and the 16-inch MacBook Pro for $2,500 or only $2,200 on sale, which is a crazy good deal. And now getting into the differences, the first thing I want to discuss is the design and portability, which in this case, the new redesigned M2 MacBook Air is by far the thinnest of them all and the most portable in terms of the footprint, being quite similar to the M1 MacBook Air, while the 16-inch is massive in comparison, as well as being by far the heaviest at 4.8 pounds, about 78% heavier than the M2 Air. But in terms of the overall design itself, the Air is basically a smaller version of the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, so it looks amazing compared to the older looking M1 Air and M2 MacBook Pro, which unfortunately did not get a redesign and don't come with MagSafe fast charging support like the others do. Now, in terms of the keyboards and the trackpads, they're all very similar with the newer style of Magic keys, which are very nice. However, the M2 MacBook Pro is the only one that still has the touch bar, which I don't really care for because I prefer the function keys with the built-in Touch ID sensor, which all of them have. And as far as the trackpads, they all have basically the same one, with larger trackpads as you get to the more expensive and larger MacBook Pros, which is nice, and they're Force Touch, so they beat out all of the other Windows laptops out there. Now, in terms of the ports, all three of the lower end M1 and M2 MacBooks come with two Thunderbolt 3 ports and a headphone jack, while the newer M2 models do support high impedance headphones, and only the M2 Air comes with the MagSafe 3-port in terms of the bottom end. And of course, both the 14 and 16-inch come with the MagSafe 3-port. They actually come with 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, which are faster, and on the other end, they come with an SD-XC card slot and an HDMI 2.0 port. So these are by far the best in terms of the actual ports and connectivity, and they're also the best in terms of the display support because they support between 2 and 4 displays, combining the Thunderbolt ports with the HDMI port, while the lower end M1 and M2 models only support 1 external display without using any additional extra hardware. Now, moving on to the actual displays, there are a lot of differences to talk about, but the biggest one is the notch and notchless designs. As you can see, the M1 and the M2 Pro have the old design, so they do not come with a notch, which also means that they only come with 720p webcams compared to 1080p on the M2 Air and the 14 and 16-inch, and I'm going to show you guys the differences in just a minute. And in terms of the actual nits or the brightness of the displays, the M2 Pro and the M2 Air have 500 nits, while the older M1 comes with 400, and these all have pretty good color support with P3 wide color gamut, while I think the M2 Air does support 10 billion colors in terms of the software support, so that's really nice. But the 14 and 16-inch come with much better mini LED displays compared to the conventional LCDs, which can actually go up to a peak of 1600 nits or 1000 nits sustained across the entire screen with a white page for hours and hours on end. So that is really, really nice for HDR editing or color grading. But when you're using them in normal use cases, they're limited to 500, just like these M2 MacBooks. However, you can download the Vivid app using the link below to unlock the full sustained 1000 nits of brightness all the time without any risks or issues, because that's how Apple Apple builds them to work, so definitely check that out. But in terms of the actual display quality, these mini LED displays look really nice because they give you better colors that pop out more, and they have much deeper blacks which go basically all the way pitch black because the actual backlight is turned off in those areas with local dimming zones, so they look really nice compared to the LCD displays that have basically gray all around the display. And not only that, but the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros also support 120Hz refresh rate ProMotion, which means that when you're browsing or playing games or whatever, you get up to 120 Hz of refresh rate, so it looks super smooth and a lot more pleasant compared to these other lower-end MacBooks that are stuck at 60 Hz all the time. And now with that said, let's talk about the speaker quality. Now the M2 Air did get a new system with 4 speakers, but to be honest, it doesn't sound that much better than the M2 Pro or the M1 Air. In fact, some people still think the M1 Air sounds better, and that might be because there are no longer speaker grills on the M2 Air because it got smaller. But if you really care about speaker quality, the 14 and 16-inch sound a lot better, especially the 16-inch, which has the most volume and by far the most bass. Just hear it for yourself. And just like I mentioned before, the M1 Air and the M2 MacBook Pro are still stuck with the 720p webcams compared to 1080p on the M2 Air and the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. So check out this clip and also listen for the microphone differences as well. This is the webcam and microphone quality on the M1 MacBook Air. This is the webcam and microphone quality on the new M2 MacBook Air. This is the webcam and microphone quality on the new M2 MacBook Pro. This is the webcam and microphone quality on the 14-inch MacBook Pro. And this is the webcam and microphone quality on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Now, in terms of battery life, the M2 MacBook Pro is going to give you the best because with the M2 chip, it has 4 efficiency cores, which are combined with a pretty decently sized battery and a small 13-inch 60 Hz display, which uses less power than these larger machines. Now, beyond that, you're going to get better battery life with the M2 Air, and then following the M1 Air, and then finally the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros have the least amount of battery life in terms of the general lineup. And now with that said, getting into the CPU performance, we have some differences here. Of course, the M2 chips are clocked the highest with the latest technology, so they have the fastest single core performance, and that actually helps make the whole system feel snappy and load things up faster, as well as giving you faster web browsing performance, which is actually really impressive compared to even the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. Now, because these chips have more performance cores, they also have the most multi-core performance. And even the binned base model 14-inch M1 Pro has a lot more performance than the M2 chip, so keep that in mind for all of your programs like, let's say, Xcode programming or running a lot of tracks in Logic Pro. You also have the Lightroom photo editing as well, which is now using a bit more of the GPU, but still it relies on some CPU. So if you have some tasks that rely on the CPU, of course, the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros are gonna be the best. Now, in terms of graphics, we have a similar story. The base M1 Air is gonna have the least amount of performance because it has a 7-core binned model, which you can upgrade to the 8-core, but of course the M2 Air comes with that 8-core already at the base price, and it's quite a bit faster, honestly, than it was last year. Now, the M2 Air can be upgraded from an 8-core to a 10-core, but because it's fanless, you might not see that big of gains, so we honestly don't recommend upgrading to the 10-core on at least the Air model. And of course, the 14 and 16-inch have the M1 Pro and M1 Max with insane numbers of graphics cores up to 32 on the M1 Max, so if you care a lot about graphics performance, you definitely want to stick with these two. And if you're confused on which one you should buy in terms of the M1, the M2, the M1 Pro, and the M1 Max chips, I would honestly say that these ones, especially the M1 Max, are really only for the people who are very serious about productivity work, and also for those who use their MacBook for business, where time is money and it's worth spending more to get your work done as fast as possible. But for everybody else, honestly, the M1 Pro is definitely more than fast enough, and even the M2 chip is more than fast enough for the majority of people out there. And now, with that said, I do want to address some of the issues that we've been seeing with the M2 MacBooks. First of all, if you're getting the base 256 gigs of storage, you could have some slowdowns in terms of the actual transfer speeds, because this M2 MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, in terms of the base storage, is actually 2 times slower than the base M1 Air, which is cheaper in terms of the read speed. So you could actually get some lower multitasking performance if you're doing some productivity work, so keep that in mind. And because of that, we recommend upgrading to at least 512 gigs of storage on these M2 machines. You don't necessarily have to do that on the M1 Air because it does have the faster SSDs in the base model, so that's nice if you're really trying to save money. But these two machines, the 14 and 16, already come with 512, which is a pretty decent starting point. And of course, you can upgrade to 1 terabyte on these machines, which is worth it if you're already spending that much money. Now, in terms of the RAM, these machines come with 8 gigs standard, while the 14 and 16 come with 16 gigs, which I would say is a decent area to stay at unless you're doing a lot of productivity work. Then you might want to upgrade. But in terms of these, if you're doing a lot of productivity work and multitasking, I would definitely recommend going up to 16 gigs of RAM. However, that creates an issue because with the M2 Air, if you upgrade to the 512 gig SSD and then you also upgrade to 16 gigs of RAM, you're looking at $1,600, while of course this 14-inch MacBook Pro you can get on sale for $1,800, and it has a ton of advantages over the M2 MacBook Air. So I would say if you really care enough about productivity to upgrade the RAM on the M2, you might as well just be looking at these higher end machines. So with that said, let me get into my buyer's guide portion where I recommend who should buy each one of these MacBooks. Now, starting with the M1 MacBook Air, this is perfect for the person who's just trying to get into Apple laptops and wants to spend a little amount of money because you can buy it for $850, which is a killer deal, basically destroying all other Windows laptops. So if you have light usage or some light business use, this is great. Now, as far as the M2 MacBook Air, I think this one is for those people who really want the fresh redesign, who like the new design, who like the notch, the better display. That is for those people that are willing to spend the money on the extra design. Now, in terms of the M2 MacBook Pro, that's for the people who don't want to go up to the 14-inch. They absolutely can't spend $1,800, but they do want a fan for extended workloads, which honestly, I would really recommend going for the 14-inch if you're considering the fan with the M2 MacBook Pro. But of course, it's there for those people who just cannot squeeze out any more budget. Now, of course, the 14-inch, I would say, is the overall best value of all if you're doing productivity work, definitely. And the 16-inch is for those who really love the large display, they love the better speakers, the better battery life that you can get compared to the 14-inch, and of course, those who really want to go all out with the M1 Max chip, trying to get as much possible performance as they can get. So with that said, I have links down below to all of these MacBooks, all the sales that you can find, especially the crazy good deal, $2,200 for the 16-inch or $850 for this M1 MacBook Air.